Millionaire catches Black Maid. Protecting his mother. What happens next? Will shock you. A wealthy man, admired for his success, comes home one night to find something that leaves him frozen in disbelief. In the quiet of his mansion, his elderly mother trembles in fear as a masked intruder lurks nearby. And there between danger and his frail mother stands the last person he ever expected. His maid. She shields his mother with nothing but her own body, prepared to sacrifice herself. But instead of gratitude, suspicion takes root, fueled by prejudice he never questioned before. What he uncovers next will test his values, his humanity, and expose truths that shake the foundation of privilege and power. The man at the center of this story was Richard Caldwell, a self-made millionaire who built an empire in finance. His mansion sat high above the city on a sprawling estate, a place where silence hung heavy except for the rustle of the trees and the faint hum of luxury. For years, he lived detached from the simple routines of the house, leaving the day-to-day care of his elderly mother, Eleanor, to hired help. Among them was a quiet, diligent woman named Grace. She had been with the household for nearly 5 years, tending to Eleanor with patience and devotion. Grace was more than just an employee. To Eleanor, she was a companion, someone who listened, laughed softly at old stories, and held her hand when tremors of age stole her strength. But to Richard, she was invisible, another staff member in the background of his successful life. His trust was in her work, not in her person. And though Eleanor often spoke of Grace's kindness, Richard rarely paused long enough to notice. On that particular evening, Richard returned early from a business trip, his mind full of stock charts and contracts. He wasn't expecting to walk into a storm of fear. As his car pulled into the driveway, the lights inside his home flickered strangely, and a faint thud echoed from the back corridor. A cold unease gripped him. He moved quickly through the halls, his polished shoes clicking against marble, until he saw it. His mother's room slightly ajar, shadows shifting within. What he witnessed when he pushed that door open would forever alter the way he saw loyalty, fear, and the hidden cost of prejudice. Richard's breath caught as the door swung wide. The first thing he saw was his mother, frail and trembling in her chair, her eyes wide with terror. Standing before her, body rigid with defiance, was Grace. Her arms were spread protectively, shielding Eleanor from a masked intruder who towered over them with menacing intent. For a moment, the scene seemed unreal, like a snapshot torn from a nightmare. The intruder clutched a crowbar, his gaze darting toward Richard before shifting back to Grace. The maid did not flinch. She stood firm, her voice steady though her hands quivered. "You won't touch her," she said, though Richard barely registered the words. He was too stunned by the sight of a woman he had scarcely acknowledged risking everything for his mother's safety. With adrenaline surging, Richard lunged forward. The intruder panicked, bolting through the open window he had used to slip inside. The crash of glass and the scrape of shoes against stone echoed through the night until silence reclaimed the room. Richard turned back, his heart pounding. His mother clutched Grace's hand tightly, refusing to let go. Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she whispered her gratitude to the woman who had shielded her. But Richard's gaze lingered not on the act of courage he had just witnessed, but on the uncomfortable narrative that surfaced in his mind. His wealth, his neighborhood, his world had conditioned him to distrust. A black woman standing in the middle of a break in it sparked suspicion instead of gratitude. The police arrived minutes later, lights flashing across manicured hedges. Statements were taken, questions asked. Grace explained how she had found Eleanor in danger and stood her ground, buying time until Richard arrived. The officers nodded, jotting notes, yet Richard's thoughts twisted. Why had she been there at that precise moment? How had she noticed the intruder before anyone else? That night, Richard couldn't sleep. Instead of relief, doubt gnawed at him. He replayed the image over and over, Grace standing tall, protecting his mother. But behind his closed eyes, the scene morphed into suspicion. Was it possible she had staged the moment to win favor, or worse, had some connection to the man who broke in? These weren't questions born from evidence, but from prejudice, subtle and insidious. Over the following days, his unease grew. Grace continued her duties, tending to Eleanor with the same patience as always. Eleanor, in turn, became even more attached, her gratitude unwavering. "She saved me," Eleanor repeated as if Richard might forget. But Richard didn't forget. He analyzed Grace's movements, her expressions, even the way she lingered near windows as she dusted. He began to treat her not as the heroine of the night, but as a potential suspect. The tension became suffocating. Richard's doubts clashed with his mother's unwavering trust, creating a silent war within the household. Grace seemed to notice the coldness in his eyes, yet she carried on quietly, dignified, as though used to such scrutiny. Her silence was not submission, it was resilience. Still, Richard's privilege and fear blinded him to the truth. He was a man who trusted money, contracts, and control. To trust Grace, he would have to dismantle everything he thought he knew about loyalty, race, and worth. And that was a battle he had never expected to fight. The breaking point was coming, and with it, a revelation that would shake the very foundation of his beliefs. It was late one evening when Richard's simmering suspicion erupted into confrontation. He returned home earlier than expected and found Grace once again in his mother's room. She was closing the curtains, her figure silhouetted against the glow of the streetlights outside. Something in the way she moved, cautious and deliberate, snapped the thread of restraint he had been holding on to. His voice cut the air sharp and accusing, demanding to know what she was doing, why she always seemed to appear at moments of danger. His mother stirred in protest, but Richard's mind was ablaze with every whispered doubt he had nurtured since the break-in. The air thickened with tension, and Eleanor's weak voice trembled as she tried to defend the woman who had protected her. But Richard barely listened. His words, laced with distrust, hung heavy in the room. Then, in the midst of his anger, a knock rattled the door. A police officer stood outside, asking for Grace by name. Richard's chest tightened, his suspicions roared into certainty, but what unfolded shattered him. The officer revealed they had caught the intruder. He had been hiding in a nearby neighborhood, and through interrogation, confessed he had been casing the Caldwell estate for weeks. The only reason Eleanor had not been harmed that night was because Grace had noticed the sign's unfamiliar footprints. Near the garden, a lock that seemed tampered with and had stayed vigilant. She had placed herself in the line of danger, fully aware of the risk, to protect a woman who was not her family, but had become like one. The weight of the truth struck Richard with devastating force. His accusations, his distrust, his prejudice all stood in stark contrast to Grace's courage. His mother's tears were not only of relief but of quiet disappointment in her son's blindness. Richard, the millionaire who prided himself on reading people in boardrooms and negotiations, had failed to see the truth standing before him in his own home. It was a reckoning, and for Richard, there would be no turning away from what had been revealed about himself. In the days that followed, the Caldwell estate felt heavier than ever. For Eleanor, the ordeal had reinforced what she already knew. Grace was more than a maid. She was family, a lifeline of compassion in her twilight years. But for Richard, the experience carved a wound far deeper than embarrassment. He had not just doubted Grace, he had failed her. He had failed his mother. He had failed himself. The police report cleared Grace of any suspicion. The community even praised her courage, with whispers of admiration spreading among neighbors, who had once overlooked her presence. Yet the approval of others could not erase the memory of Richard's mistrust. Grace carried herself with the same quiet dignity, continuing her work with patience and care. But there was a silence in her eyes that Richard could no longer ignore. It was the silence of someone who had seen this pattern before, someone used. To being doubted, no matter how much they gave, Richard began to notice the invisible weight Grace bore each day. How she moved carefully in stores where security eyes lingered too long. How she remained polite to strangers who questioned her place in his neighborhood. How she never raised her voice, as though the world would not permit her mistakes. What had once been invisible to him became undeniable. And in that realization, Richard saw the cost of his privilege, how easily he had defaulted to suspicion, when gratitude and trust were owed instead. One evening he sat across from his mother and confessed his shame. Eleanor, frail but resolute, told him plainly, "Wealth means nothing if it blinds you to humanity." The words pierced him. For the first time, Richard listened. The mansion no longer felt like the fortress it once was. To Richard, its walls echoed with the reminder that protection did not come from money, but from the courage of those too often overlooked. Grace had given more than loyalty, she had given proof of love in the face of danger. And yet, he had nearly destroyed that gift with suspicion rooted in prejudice. The question lingers still. How many acts of sacrifice are ignored, dismissed, or doubted because of the color of the hand that offers them? And what does it cost us, individually and as a society, when we fail to see the humanity standing right in front of us? If this story touched you, please like the video and share it so others can reflect on its message. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life lessons that open hearts and challenge prejudice. Together, we can spread compassion, one story at a time.